If we start, though, momentarily just from an assumption that we can successfully modify unborn babies so that we edit out certain nasty diseases, you might argue that that is immoral to tamper in any way and that we're playing God, although we're already, in a sense, playing God through artificial insemination and so forth. But I think it's important to recognize that if we are capable of modifying, editing out diseases safely, then by deciding not to do that, in a sense, philosophically, we're making a decision that has moral consequences as well. So by not acting,
you're quite right.
You could argue we're acting immorally.
Well, I think we had that discussion actually in Oxford, if I remember correctly.
You and I.
Yes, I think
we were on stage in Oxford. Yeah.
I think I remember saying to you that I think I said that actually playing God is quite good because, of course, it's using a God-given, if you're believing God, as a God-given intelligence, which, we should use. But the point was using it wisely. The point is using it, and of course, it's unwise to tamper with something where you don't know where the answer is going to be favorable or where the risks are so great, or even if they're small and so serious. So that, I think, is the issue partly. But you're completely right that not to do something is also playing God. It's like the old Jewish thing where, I don't know if you remember the story, there's a man in a valley somewhere and the dam has burst and all the villages are being evacuated because the floodwaters are rising. And he goes from the kitchen up to the first floor to the bedroom, and the police come on and say, look, for goodness sake, get out, you're going to drown. And he says, no, I'll be fine. I'm religious. I believe in God. And then finally he gets up onto the roof and a helicopter comes and tries to rescue him. And he says, no, I don't need rescuing. I've got complete faith in God. And he eventually goes to the pearly gates and he meets God. And he says, I'm so angry. You didn't rescue me. And God said, I sent you rescue 3 times and you didn't pay any attention.
It reminds me of the story of the man who slips off the edge of a cliff, and he's hanging just by his fingernails to the cliffside. And he in his exasperation, he looks up and shouts out, "Is anyone out there?" And God bellows down and says, "Just hold on to that puffy white cloud, my son, and it will bear you gently, lightly down to the basin of the cliff, to the base of the cliff." And the man thinks about this for a couple of seconds as he's desperately clinging on to the cliff. And then he shouts up again and said, "Is there anyone else out there?" Doesn't quite buy it, in other words. Jokes are quite hard to tell, I think, Robert, on Zoom, but you're laughing.
No, I think, well, they're important. I mean, jokes aren't necessarily meant to be funny. I mean, they're parables, aren't they? And they're parables in a sense. And I think that they are important because they're used in all sorts of religious and non-religious. So, I mean, basically, one of the interesting things about the human is that, and that's how we learn by telling stories. We were, thousands of years ago, we would be at the mouth of a cave and people would come home from the hunt and the story would be how the day went. That's how we taught our children. That's how we taught each other. And, that's why we watch some television programs very easily and some we don't like because they don't tell a story. Telling a story is a really important part of the creation. That's one of the reasons why I think in the theatre, so often it happens in opera too, in productions, where actually Jonathan Miller was made sure he told a story. The story was clear. That was one of the reasons why his productions were successful, because actually they engage you. And I think a good author makes sure that the story is there. The story mustn't be interrupted too much. It has to be a thread.
We've got questions from the audience, and I want to bring us back to the pandemic before we end. But first of all, just on reproduction, do you feel that there are further major developments ahead in the years to come?
Yes, of course. Of course. I mean, I don't know what they'll be, but I can think, first of all, I don't think we're using the drugs we're using, which are A, expensive, and B, very inefficient, and third, rather unpleasant. So I think we will stop stimulating the ovary the way we're doing. I think we haven't bothered with the ovarian physiology, which is a major failure. I think secondly, we will find that some of the ways of harvesting eggs at the moment for freezing are really very crude. I think we will find ways of preserving female fertility without needing to do that. And I would also argue that we will in fact improve all sorts of aspects of how we can culture the embryo in better. Those are just three ideas. So yes, I think that will be important. And I think we will have better ways of looking at how we diagnose some of the illnesses that humans find so threatening in early reproduction. And most important, I think eventually we'll come to the time when we understand the right environment for the embryo inside the uterus, which encourages the best possible growth, the best possible nurture, and the best possible use of the genes it's going to make.
But what does early diagnosis lead to?
I think it leads to prevention, and ultimately prevention of illness.
How? Because we're talking prenatally.
Well, I think there may be ways of treating things which we haven't thought about, and I think trying to improve the environment of the embryo is a very good way of doing that.
I want to ask you, just while we've got you, about cancer, because I made a documentary for the BBC a long time ago as well with Sir Paul Nurse. And I mean, you're a geneticist as well, and he won the Nobel Prize for working out how yeast cells divide, I think, which could have still important implications for cancer treatment. Where do you think we'll get to in the next 20, 30 years with curing cancer?
Well, Paul is the person to answer this, of course, and of course he's a much better scientist than I am. I mean, Paul is an amazing individual. But I think what we will find is that increasingly cancer will not be a fatal disease, but a chronic disease. It'll be an illness, and we will actually, in fact, palliate more and more, so it becomes less and less important. People will live longer and will live with it without dreadful effects, because actually we will find ways of impairing its spread, impairing its growth, and therefore impairing its threats. And I think that's already happening. I mean, already we're seeing a lot of cancers that 8 years ago, 9 years ago, we thought would be the kiss of death within the next year or two. And that's not always happening now. And I think there are many cancers where that has, I mean, one of the first ones was uterine cancer, by the way. You know, very early on, uterine cancer was fatal. And actually, we found a drug, not we, but I mean, actually the unit that I did work in at one time, before I was there, I'm not responsible for it, but found a drug which actually was extremely effective. And it made a massive difference to the prognosis of that disease. It's now virtually 100% curable.
Laura wants to know, as a single 32-year-old woman who wants a family, whether, and she's considering egg freezing, whether that's giving her false hope.
To some extent, it is giving false hope. If you look at the British statistics, which are not presented properly by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, in my opinion, I think they're very misleading. But my parliamentary questions to the Ministry of Health have shown that actually probably that each egg that is frozen probably has less than a 1% chance of becoming a live child after the treatment. That in fact, what the statistics are not doing is to taking into account eggs that don't thaw properly or eggs that don't fertilize properly. And that makes a very big difference. There are all sorts of ways, unfortunately, which the HFEA knows about, which actually make the statistics better than they really are. And I think that that's shameful. And in my view, they should be criticized. And I think at some point we have to take action in Parliament to ensure that people have better information. Now, to answer the question directly, if you're going to freeze your eggs, you have to understand that at the moment, the best birth rate you can expect in Britain is around about 19%, something like that. That's the overall, but actually in practice, it's probably a lot lower. And the number of people who've had babies after thawed eggs have been treated is really very small. And of course, we will improve, but the freezing process, you know, isn't really quite as good as we think it is, and it's not likely to be ever perfect. So, yeah, if you're going to freeze your eggs, do it as young as possible. And probably at 32, it's already a bit old, actually, but it's still possible then. But by mid-30s, it becomes very questionable.
I'm a 40-year-old man, Robert, and I want to have a family. I'm single. Should I be freezing my sperm?
It's much easier to freeze sperm because, in fact, they don't contain water or very little water, and that's a very big difference. The chemistry of the sperm is very different, whilst the egg actually is, unfortunately, the worst possible shape. It's a perfect sphere. So it doesn't have all, it has less interaction with the outside environment, and that makes a very big difference to the way it freezes. So we vitrify it, which means snap freezing very suddenly. But actually, that isn't quite perfect, and it's difficult to see how it could be made better, but probably it will be. But sperm have always been capable of being frozen, though actually men, by the time they're in their 40s, mid-40s, start actually to produce sperm which are slightly less good, but then, you've got people like, Picasso, who got having children to God knows what age. And a lot of Roman emperors did as well when they survived the poisons that they might have taken. But I think the answer is the sperm and egg can't be seen as being compatible. They're very different.
Did you notice that news story very recently that suggested that birth rate is declining or is going to decline in the coming decades in the Western world? And that's going to, although you might think superficially that's very good news for the climate, will pose all sorts of potential problems.
Yeah, well, it's been declining for a long time. I mean, when I was first a doctor, the age of first birth for a woman was in the early 20s. And now the age of first birth in Britain is about 31. So it's changed massively. Far more older people are wanting to have babies. And at one level, that's very good because it shows that women are now being equal, are being treated equally, are in jobs, getting professions, getting education, contributing much more to the economy. But of course, unfortunately, they're penalized by society because we don't support them having children while they're still young enough to have children without much difficulty. And I think one of the really serious social issues that we should be facing but haven't even remotely touched is how we support people to have a family in that circle, females to have the proper support in that way. Childcare is so expensive, for example, and usually now both partners have to work to have what is a reasonable standard of living. And I'm talking, of course, it's a middle class idea to some extent, but it applies to working classes and well-off people as well. And I think actually we need to think about how we restructure that issue.
Shelley asks, are there any of your IVF babies that particularly stand out in your memory?
Well, some of them have had, some of the IVF women have had grandchildren now, which is amazing. And yes, do you know what? So many stand out, actually.
There are some extraordinary stories, though.
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely extraordinary. And, and some women who I absolutely refused to do IVF for, who then got pregnant spontaneously. One woman who came to me, I don't want to tell the story because it's in this memoir, and I think it's such a fascinating story, but there was no chance you could get pregnant with IVF. There was no chance you could get pregnant with surgery. She was coming from an ethnic area where her fertility was essential if she was going to survive the marriage, if the marriage was going to survive. And I refused to treat her. And finally, she insisted if she went back to her home without having had an operation, she would be divorced and she'd have to leave her place where she lived. And after massive discussion with my colleagues, I did an exploratory operation just so she had a scar in her abdomen, really. And then forgot all about her. And a year later, she suddenly appeared in my clinic saying, just as you predicted, I'm now pregnant.
Amazing story. Ab says,
so many of them.
Will humans ever be smart enough to understand and defeat depression?
Well, I think we'll get better. The research that's going on in depression, my close relative John Reisner is doing some amazing work actually on depression, and I think there are some really exciting things going on in understanding it. So I think yes, I think we will see much more about understanding the chemistry of it than we do at the moment. One of the problems with mental illness is that for years we've not actually made a diagnosis. We just talk about the symptoms as a diagnosis. We talk about depression. We don't talk about the phenotype, actually what's causing the problem. Just as we do with infertility. We treat people with in vitro fertilization, but we don't make a diagnosis. We just say that they're infertile, which is crazy. So we give them drugs without making a diagnosis, which is bad medicine. And that's exactly the same in mental health. We need to make a diagnosis and then give the specific treatment for that diagnosis. And until we learn to do that, we're not doing that properly because private practice doesn't allow it enough. We are actually in this situation of doing very bad medicine sometimes. Not always, but sometimes.
Some great questions coming in. Isabella says, do you think your strong connections with theatre and the arts influence how you do science? Because as we've discussed, I think how Jonathan did science probably had some sort of impact the other way around.
There's no question. I think doing theatre influenced the way I write. It definitely introduces the way I teach, particularly how I teach. I do quite a lot of schools outreach, and the way I talk to children and to young adults I think, is very much influenced by that. And of course, above all, as you rightly say, it taught me how to work a group, because as a director, you're trying to get people who are very self-conscious, who are often very self-absorbed, to actually interact with each other in a family way. And that requires a lot of persuasion sometimes, and a lot of encouragement, a lot of support. And at the same time, of course, you're looking at a balance sheet, you're running a budget, you've got to fill the theatre. And of course, in Edinburgh, we were absolutely competing with an awful lot of people. So in fact, to get headlines, was considered a huge success, because you managed to get enough interest. And I think, it's pretty sad at the moment, because the arts are under such threat. But theatre will survive probably quicker than music, because of course, I feel very sorry for musicians, because of course they have to work together. A few musicians, of course, will be brilliant soloists, but that hardly works in a crisis like this. And, most of the music we hear or involve ourselves with is either teaching somebody else, which is interaction, or working with other musicians. They don't work alone. And they are hugely penalized, and of course already very poorly paid. Whereas theatre will survive, because I think we'll find ways around how we manage the isolation and so on. But yes, has it influenced my career and the way I do things in science? Undoubtedly. I think, telling a story, getting people interested in something, looking at parallels, looking at metaphor. Metaphor is very important in human affairs, and in science we use metaphor all the time.
I was going to name check John Gordon, because you mentioned the New York doctor, John Gordon. And of course, John Gordon is the man who set up How to Academy. He's the man we have to thank for being here.
John Gordon.
And he's written in to say this is an outrageously fascinating discussion. Thank you both. The other John Gordon. A couple more questions, if we can quickly fit them in from the audience, because I've never been involved in an event where so many people want to ask questions. And Jackie says, your view then on how science is viewed. So, for example, anti-vaxxers, climate change skeptics, world leaders at the moment, almost creating their own science. How did this happen, Jackie in Birmingham?
Well, isn't that why we have things like How to Academy? Of course, that is what we have to do. People who are prepared to think, and people who are prepared to try and do the science need to work together to actually engage each other, and then hopefully we can engage people to show how necessary what we're doing is and how advantageous it is. And the anti-vaxxer thing is it sounds, Paul Nurse said to me the other day, he said, 14% of people say that they would not have a vaccine against COVID if it was developed. Leave aside the measles vaccine, where of course there isn't much of a threat to the individual who's an adult, but to say that you wouldn't have the vaccine against, COVID, is completely balmy, isn't it? Why would you want to run that risk when it's such an awful way of dying? From
Jackie in Birmingham to someone who's actually tuning in Oregon, in the United States on the West Coast. Thank you for sharing your time today. I'm tuning in from Oregon, and as an individual pursuing a medical career, what advice do you have for young medical students interested in reproduction and fertility? What advice do you have for medical students in general? And what has been one of the greatest challenges of your career, and how did you overcome it? So just in bite-sized chunks, Robert.
Too many questions, but let me say how wonderful you are, how lucky you are to be doing medicine. I do it again. Medicine is shot at one level politically, and the finances and everything else is wrong. But let me tell you this: no matter who the Secretary of State for Health is in Britain, most of the people listening are British. He may run the health service, but in 5 years' time, his name will be completely forgotten. But you, as a doctor, seeing a patient and just listening to them, you will be remembered in 40 years' time, and they might come up to you in the street and say, I'm so grateful for what you did to me 40 years ago. I remember so much of what you did, and it changed how I felt about things. That is a great privilege. I stood on a platform in Paris once, absolutely crowded. This huge woman was 6'5". She was massive for a female. And she stood above me and she shook me like this. And she shouted, "You got me pregnant!" And everybody looked round. Oh, I thought, oh, yes, of course. Yes, I see what you mean, So people remember what you do, and that's important. What can I say about medicine? It's a great privilege because, when you do medicine, you see people at their most vulnerable. They are in pain, they're anxious, they've got something that they think is worse than it really is about them, they're worried about their family, they're worried about money, they're concerned that they may die, perhaps in some cases, and you have them in front of you, and they're naked, if not physically, which they might be, certainly spiritually, and they're frightened you're going to do horrible things to make a diagnosis, which will be painful. So how you handle that is one of the great privileges that very few other professions have. The way you listen and the way you handle that is one of the most important aspects. So you are hugely lucky to be studying medicine.
Kay says, is there any hope for unexplained infertility, please? And of course, I mean, I know this from friends, just how difficult, how traumatizing it can be for people who are struggling to conceive.
Well, unexplained infertility is failure of a diagnosis. That's all. It's just bad medicine. I mean, most things, most situations will have a cause. And of course, that's one of the things I didn't mention in my summary. We need to understand, I mean, the more we investigate, the more we can explain unexplained infertility. We don't do it because it's much easier for a quick fix, because everybody thinks IVF is going to work, so they go to IVF. That's a fatal error, in my view. Most people actually fail IVF and then get pregnant afterwards, actually. It's an interesting thought, unless there's a concrete cause. But certainly that's true with unexplained infertility.
And Jean just says, thanks for the wonderful talk. I wonder whether, Professor Winston, what you think about the impact of repetitive ovary stimulation on women's health. Is there any advice for people who repetitively fail in IVF production?
I don't think there's much risk, actually. I mean, if you're hyperstimulated, there might be, but the average overstimulation with most of these drugs is unpleasant. It's not ideal, but I don't think it has long-term effects. The issue of cancer has been constantly raised since the 1980s, but we've never shown it really causes cancer. And I don't think there are particular risks with those drugs. I just don't think it's very efficient. I think there are better ways of doing it, which we'll find in due course.
I just want to finish with two questions. First of all, and I wanted to ask this earlier, in respect of what we've learned from the pandemic and how we're coping with it. How do you understand altruism? It's a word that you used half an hour or so ago. How do you understand altruism scientifically, and what role do you think altruism is going to have to play
Well, I'll come back
as a species in our survival?
Well, I'll come back to the bats then, where I started. The reason why we were filming the vampire bat was because if they don't get a drink of blood after 48 hours, they die. So they come back from the hunt at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning before dawn with an empty stomach. And the bats that have had a successful catch of blood, they actually regurgitate the blood from their own stomach into the mouth of the bat that is starving. And that is altruistic. And it turns out that the bats that don't do that, some bats refuse to do that, and they're ousted by the herd. And they actually, when their time comes, do not get rescued. So the genetic question is altruistic, therefore genetic or not? And we don't know. And probably, to some extent, it may be. It's a fascinating question. It's a great way to finish the conversation, because you reminded me of where I was leading.
Except to finish finally the conversation, you are someone, as I said in my introduction, who, well, you take such great pleasure from life, it seems to me. There's the music, and there's the football, and there's the science, there's the research, but there's also the human interaction, there's the helping real-life human beings. Difficult to quantify, and therefore, perhaps this is a slightly silly question, but I can't help but be tempted to ask it. What gives you the most pleasure in life?
Well, of course, it's the question you know I'm going to answer, is my grandchildren. And I mean, the thing is to see those wonderful children growing up. I'm afraid one or two of them might be listening, which is a bit worrying. But let me just say that is one of the greatest pleasures that one can have at my age, actually, is to see, your family growing and interacting and being good human beings and learning and helping them to learn sometimes, or teaching us how to do things better. And I think that probably is what most parents would say about their children, that ultimately that's why infertility is such a devastating problem, because that one privilege is being forbidden to so many people because they can't have children, and they don't have that one great pleasure that most of us get, because one of the most important things that all of us do is having children. And that's really, I suppose, why we are so shocking in that we neglect teachers. We don't recognize teachers being amongst the most important members of our society, because actually, ultimately, they have the future of our society in their hands, and the children are our future.
Professor Winston, what a brilliant way to end. It's truly a privilege to speak to you. I mean, it's just as good, actually, speaking to you on Zoom as it was on stage. The only sadness is that we can't see the audience, but I know from their reactions in the Q&A just how stimulated they have been by what you've had to say. It's incredibly generous of you to give us your time.
Thank you, Matthew, very much indeed. All the very best. Thank you.
And thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in from Oregon to Birmingham. We're really grateful to have had you over the summer. And we've got lots more events coming up throughout August and September. As at How to Academy, we're moving to a paid model. We've had so many freebies over the summer. I do hope that you'll be able to fork out the 10 quid or the 15 quid moving forward, because I think, as Robert said, the How to Academy is a valuable forum in which ideas can be discussed, and we rely on you, of course, to continue. So thank you to you, and a very special thank you to you, Robert. Stay well, stay safe. We could have talked about so many other things, but we'll do that next time. Have a wonderful weekend.